All right, so I'm hanging out here with the cat, and say hi, cat. I figured I'd do another video on history. I'm thinking about either calling it like coffee history or blue collar history, so you guys can, anybody who actually watches this shit, all two of you, help me decide in the comments. Hmm. Coffee history or blue collar history? I don't know which one sounds better. I could call it cat history. Right? So today I kind of wanted to cover a subject that everybody knows about, but they don't know really the details of it. Like everybody's heard of it, but they don't really know what went on. And I'm going to try to make this another little series too, where I sort of cover obscure parts of well-known historical events. So I figured I'd start with the Vietnam War and sort of the origins of the conflict, like where it started, because nobody really knows that. I mean, the given um, explanation is basically the North Vietnamese invaded the South Vietnamese, and the United States, seeing this as a threat, basically wanting to stop the spread of communism and protect their interests in Southeast Asia, invaded to prevent that. But I mean, you got to understand, why was there a North and South Vietnam? Why was there communists? Why did we care? You know, nobody really knows that. Why did we get involved? And this video also, I got to say in advance, is probably going to piss off some of my right wing friends, because I'm going to be a little sympathetic towards the communists, and I don't normally do that because I honestly think that's the worst sort of social and economic system you can put in place. You've got to be a real idiot. Anyway, so we're gonna start all the way back in 1884. At this time, Indochina, which was made up of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, was basically part of China itself. You know, I can't remember if it was imperial back then or not, but so what was going on was, the British and the French were trading with China pretty heavily. This is, you hear about the sphere of influence stuff, and there's a lot of the imperialist shit going on. And China, or rather Chinese pirates, who were pretty much, it's kind of lost to history, but the you'd be led to believe that they were basically state-sponsored privateers. Um, they were using the coast of Vietnam, which has a very long coast there. Um, Lots of river mouths and inlets and harbors and so on and so forth. It's a good place. They were using that to launch pirate attacks on British and French ships. So the French, in the late 1800s, the French are, tired of losing shipping to these guys. So they go China, hey, can you knock it off with the pirates? And China goes, oh, they're not our pirates. I don't know what you're talking about, which, I don't know. You could go 50-50 on that. So the French go, oh, they're not your pirates. So they go, all right, well, we'll take care of it then. So they invade, basically, in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, clear out these pirates. And in the process, they say, hey, this is a nice little spot. Let's make it a French colony. So now this is 1890s, somewhere around there. It becomes French Indochina. And it becomes an incredibly prosperous colony for the French. Basically, it's their version of Britain's India. It's their sort of the crown jewel in their empire. So time goes by, and the French occupation of Vietnam was pretty much standard fare for any sort of imperial colonial occupation at the time. Oop, I'm out of focus. All right. There was a fair amount of atrocities and, a lot of, you know, by its nature, it's not the best. The French, they brought modern medicine and modern practices and things that helped the Vietnamese people um, extend their lives and have better, easier lives. But at the same respect, they, of course, export all of the wealth out of the country and leave nothing left for the inhabitants. So that's sort of the double edged sword of colonialism. Yeah, you bring people medicine, religion, technology, but then if you take all the wealth they make exploiting these new things, you're kind of a dick. So that goes on for quite a while and brings us to the late 1930s. Now, what happened in the South Pacific, specifically that area, um, in the late 1930s? Imperial Japan. And as you know, Imperial Japan had it out with China before any of the other countries were involved in the war. They invaded China. Those two have basically hated each other since before anybody can remember. Probably before there's a written language, they're sworn enemies of each other. So the French are all posted up there, and they've got their Indochina colony, and they notice what's going on. And so they do what the French do and immediately sign a peace agreement with the Japanese, basically saying, we'll leave you alone, you leave us alone, and there'll be no problem. Japan goes, yeah, okay, sure, and immediately invades Vietnam. Basically, what they saw was Vietnam being used as a route to supply the Chinese, who they were at war with, and Vietnam itself being very rich in natural resources. Was appealing. So they went in there and it was like 2 days, and the French were beaten. And in their defense, they had signed this agreement, and so they didn't bother to build up troops or build any defenses. There was just 3 colonial garrisons in Vietnam at the time, made up of French soldiers, and they were, in a matter of, basically 3 days, surrounded and forced to surrender. So now you've got the Japanese occupying Vietnam. And of course, the Japanese do what the Japanese do. They, butcher and murder and rape and everything horrifying under the sun that you can imagine. This goes on throughout the entirety of the war. And towards the end, when the Japanese had been weakened significantly by the Americans, Australians, and British, basically been hammering them in the Pacific, the Vietnamese people under Ho Chi Minh, who you might recognize the name, organize into a group called the Viet Minh, which I cannot remember what it stands for, some sort of, revolutionary blah, 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 crap. Revolt, and they throw the Japanese out. They beat the Japanese, and they declare their independence. Basically, Indochina became Vietnam for a short period, and under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. And, that was pretty good. They're finally like, hey, we've been sort of underfoot of these European powers for so long. We can finally breathe. They're excited. They're having parades in the streets. And of course, our good friends, who you're going to hear about time and fucking time again, the British, come marching in. And they see what's going on here and they go, whoa, hold up a second. You can't govern yourselves. You're not white. And not only do they put down the Viet Minh, basically, after thanking them for kicking the Japanese's ass, they take the Japanese soldiers that had been disarmed, rearm them, and use them as colonial police to subjugate the Vietnamese people again. And that is one of the most fucked things. And now the British did a lot of horrifying shit during World War II, and I'm going to get into all of it, believe me. But this is one of those that's pretty far up there, And this is, of course, brought to you by the same people who sent Polish soldiers off to get purposely slaughtered by the Soviets. But I'm going to do a whole video on that. So the British are assholes. They're basically controlling the colony. The French come in and they say, hey, can we have our colony back? And the British turn around and go, I mean, I guess, it's your colony, but are you sure you want to take this on right now, buddy? I mean, you guys just you guys are working on rebuilding, and the French, with this strong sense of national pride, sort of to return to a sense of normalcy, go, well, this is our best colony, you don't tell us what to do, they'd been getting hammered by the Germans, and they decided they wanted to win. So they go rolling into Vietnam with, and you're going to see this a lot too, traditional World War II tactics. They go in there with their tanks and their airborne troops and all this shit, and they sort of blitz across the country. And the Viet Minh just, they crawl in their holes and they let the French do their things. And then once they get a little complacent, they strike, and that's how they've always done it. So originally, the United States. Okay, so this is going to be another video in itself. So the United States has always had this outward appearance of anti-imperialism, but sort of do as we say, not as we do type approach to it. Like, I'm going to try to cover this and do a video about the Spanish-American War. They basically became an imperial power by trying to stop imperialism. So the U.S. says, hey, this is not right. The Viet Minh fought the Japanese. They had to deal with your bullshit for years. Just leave them alone. Let them govern their own country. Who cares? It's Vietnam. It doesn't mean anything. And then the Chinese take over China. Overnight, the United States sent $1 billion, and this is $1 billion in 1954 money, to the French to arm them to stop the Vietnamese from having independence. So, yeah, that's a good one. So there you go. So the French are, doing their standard tactics thing, and they come up with this plan where they're going to basically set up forts across the country and lure the Viet Minh into open conflict where they can, take them out. Cool. We did that in Iraq. Didn't really work too well. But anyway. So then Dien Bien Phu happens. And I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Dien Bien Phu was a fort set up by the French. And it was manned by their elite airborne units, as well as, I think, some Foreign Legion. You had mechanized infantry in there. This was going to be their big win that was going to win the French people and the world over to their cause. They were going to spank the Viet Minh once and for all. This was going to be it. And what happened was they didn't just lose to the Viet Minh, who had basically taken the time to place and sight in a bunch of guns on this fort, which was static, and, shell it into oblivion, but they got slaughtered. And after that, that was it. The French people had said, you know what, this is bullshit. They lost almost the same amount of people in their Vietnam War as we did in ours. And it was like, why are we doing this? This is some little bullshit place. It doesn't affect us. Where we just lost an entire generation of men in World War II. And here it is, the 1950s. And that memory is fresh. And we're going to go around and do it again in Vietnam over. So, whatever. So, this is how you end up with your states, basically. The French sign an agreement, and in the process, they set up Laos, Cambodia, North and South Vietnam. And the idea behind this is if you divide them up, they're not going to be able to get together and get too strong. The U.S. was a big fan of this. And then there was a period of about, I believe, a year where if you were a Vietnamese citizen, you could move freely between the borders of these places and decide where you wanted to end up living. Of course, Laos and Cambodia and North Vietnam were going to be heavily communist areas, and the South was set up with a Western-style democracy. And so people went where they did. And of course, the United States at this time was pumping propaganda into the country saying, hey, if you go to the north, you're going to be murdered because these are communists and so on and so forth. And so a lot of people fled into the south, specifically the Catholics. Vietnam, because of the French occupation, was a huge Catholic country, and the Catholics thought the communists were going to kill them, which the communists ended up doing later, and for different reasons that I'll get into. I don't think initially they probably would have. And this is a little bit of a different type of communism too. This isn't that sort of some of the stuff you hear about in China where they were slaughtering people, in Cambodia where they were slaughtering. This was more of a sort of a democratic, state-controlled capitalist society. And I know that's like, people hear that shit and they roll their fucking eyes. You know, communism is communism. It's bad. Yes, this was bad. It was inefficient. It caused famine and everything else fucking horrible under the sun. But it wasn't technically true sort of red Chinese or Russian communism. It was a little bit more, I guess, liberal, you would say, with, you know, they wanted to hold elections and things like that, and they wanted people that were competent in power. So I'm not gonna sit there and meditate on that too long. But so the Western nations basically, they rallied all behind this South Vietnamese government, which was run by a Catholic man who was wholly corrupt. He gave government positions basically to all of his family members, including his sister-in-law, who would go on the TV, or the radio rather at the time, and openly mock the Buddhist population of the country. That was what actually ended up, those demonstrations where those Buddhists set themselves on fire. That was because of her. She was a real peach. These guys, and they set up, now of course American history will have you remember that, you know, South Vietnam was this peaceful democracy. And what happened was they turned around and they basically prevented the elections that were going to be guaranteed a year out in the original French treaty, which of course Ho Chi Minh was going to win. He was a popular guy. He kicked the Japanese out of the country. He kicked the French out of the country. He was going to be the president of all of Indochina. And a lot of these countries, they turned down, you know, because of the French influence, the American influence. They basically said, oh, no, you're not having elections. This is your president. You know, don't worry about it. And so they turned their back on that deal. The North was pissed. I just lost my train of thought. This is a lot of shit. And it's kind of funny that nobody knows about this. They just think, oh, we just invaded Vietnam. No, this shit started back in the 1800s. So anyway, South Vietnam is a police state, and it's run by a dictator. It's not a democracy. These people aren't peaceful. He brutalized his own citizens. He imprisoned people who spoke out against him. He embezzled money, robbed the population, you know, worse than Ho Chi Minh. And I'm sorry, he really was. He you know, Ho Chi Minh wasn't the best guy. He was a dictator himself, but I think that he cared about his people in the sense of the greater good. Not so much the guy in South Vietnam, and I can't remember his name. It's something stupid, but he just wanted to line his own pockets and subjugate the people. He was basically a stand-in for the French colonial government. That was all he was. So people are pissed. And now this is another interesting part. Now you of course expect me to next say, oh well, the North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam, and that's what happened because of, you know, this government and so on and so forth. But that's not what happened at all. Ho Chi Minh was strictly against the Viet Cong activity. He was against having the North Vietnamese army invade. He wanted a peaceful election. That's what he wanted. And when he got that election, he knew that he would consolidate power. Vietnam would be united under his communist rule. And that would have been it. And honestly, if you look at this thing politically and historically, and you sort of learn about these individuals, we're talking about it would have been a state capitalist country. They didn't get along with China, which is our biggest fear, that China was going to move down in there and use that as a jumping point to invade our territory in the Philippines. They didn't get along with China. They didn't get along with China until the war fully broke out against the U.S., and they had to make peace with them, basically. In fact, the Chinese were even the Chinese communists were very happy that the French were resubjugating the Vietnamese people because they didn't fucking like them. So, Vietnam being such a rich country, if you had allowed the communists to take power, I would have given it 5 years and that would have been a capitalist country. There's just no way around it. So slowly but surely you have independent guerrilla activity starting to pop up here and there, and sort of the South is responding to it with their own little bit of bullshit. Very poorly, because again, this is an army that's run by somebody who is actively stealing from the country. So the South Vietnamese army was often deprived of food, weapons, training, because all that money went into people's pockets instead of into the soldiers. So the South Vietnamese army is getting its ass kicked. The United States sends over advisors to help them train, and now things get a little bit more serious. Ho Chi Minh is still holding back his North Vietnamese army because he does not want a war with the United States. He's a smart guy. He finally endorses the Viet Cong, which went by, I think, People's Liberation something, or NPLA. I can't remember what it stands for. It was some acronym. They didn't call themselves the Cong. That was a nickname that was kind of made up on the spot. It's short for Vietnamese communists, basically. So they Ho Chi Minh finally goes, you know what? If it's going to pressure, a regime change, I'm going to go ahead and allow these Viet Cong dudes to go in there and do bombings and guerrilla raids and fuck with the economy and fuck with the government, because this is bullshit. I should be, so on and so forth. So he does that. The U.S. responds in kind by sending in troops, and finally, basically, you have war. That's when you have the full get out there. And we all know, of course, how that turned out. And it's interesting today, if you look at Vietnam, it's fairly capitalist. And I really think that would have happened probably in the 60s if we had just left it well enough alone, So, I could get into sort of the more of the meat and potatoes of the war itself, the American war anyway. And again, I'm doing this all from memory, so if it's historically inaccurate, I apologize. I'm kind of jumping around back and forth, and this is a pretty long video. If you have any sort of questions about that, or you'd like me to get into more detail, feel free to ask in the comments when I post this. And definitely, I'm going to try uploading some of this shit to YouTube. So help me decide coffee history or blue collar history. All right, thanks for sticking it out with me.